Egalitarian Autocracy, Voluntary Egalitarian Autocracy.
Do you have fond memories of your childhood, the so-called formative years?
Were your parents, both your father and your mother, loving, patient, long-suffering, never raised their voice to criticize, nor their hand to punish, but calmly taught you everything that you know?
And they patiently explained why you will go to bed at 8, or why you shouldn't argue with them, even though they were both dead wrong.
And you have but the utmost respect for them both.
Or was it, while you live under my roof, you'll live by my rules, and you couldn't wait to get out on your own, so you didn't have to listen to them anymore, or do the things they demanded?
Your experience is typical of most of the US, Canada, Europe, and most of the societies that allegedly permit free thought. Humankind has the innate desire to be free of oppression and unnecessary restrictions. And then when you got your own apartment, your own car, and your own whatever, then the problems began. Your parents were just replaced by, quote, government agents who restricted your freedoms, extorted you fees, obligated you to participate in bureaucratic procedures that further impinge on your money, time, and freedom. You realized and recognized that something was wrong with society, but you just could not decipher what it was. To help you understand just what is going on with society, think about
those 13 long years of public indoctrination, euphemistically referred to as public education. Or were you traumatized from the experience? Were there certain principles taught that bothered you more than the principle? Certain abuses of the slaves, that is, students, by the slave owners, the teachers, and the principal, that were morally wrong, and you apparently could not do anything about it, but wished you could have. Or maybe you did do something, and then was stigmatized to the end of that public indoctrination as a rabble-rouser, a revolutionary, or antisocial. There was a very important reason for this indoctrination that I would love to discuss with you personally. I want our discussion here to be a personal, private experience, just you and me. Since I cannot be there physically, I'm using this medium to reach out across the expanse of time and space. And with all my heart, with all my mind, I've poured my soul and my might into this documentary. So I'm going to be 100% honest with you. My intention is to enroll you in one of the most revolutionary and freeing changes ever to spark life into humanity, and I will show you the door, but you must be the one to open it, to quote the fictional character Morpheus of Matrix. But what was never spoken in the movie, but was just dramatically shown, was there was a catch. My success depends entirely on your success. Although I've used the allegory of the fictional work by Warner Brothers Pictures, let me assure you that what we will discuss today is seriously real, and how you react to the presentation will be different for everyone. But I sincerely guarantee that this work will be beneficial and help us all to obtain real personal freedom, something that you can see and taste and feel and smell. Let's take a critical look to understand in just which type of society we live. Consider the model given us since childhood for 13 long years in the U.S., the so-called educational system. There were the masters, the principal and teachers, the slaves, the hapless students, victims of society. Blind obedience to, quote, authority, unquote, was considered, quote, good, unquote, and rewarded, whereas individual thinking was punished and considered, quote, bad, unquote. This is the model that the global elite wanted to condition and indoctrinate into your conduct, to be a good little robot. To further decipher our society, could you give me a good definition of democracy? The dictionary defines it as government by the people, a form of government in which the supreme power, translate supreme force, is vested in the people and exercised directly by them. Entirely false. or by their elected agents under a free electoral system. And remember, governed by force. This is only partially true, but mostly false. Democracy is the rule of the people by a tiny group of people, the supreme ruling class, by force. It is not rule of all the people by all of the people. There are 545 members of Congress and 315.6 million people living in the U.S. Calculating that is 0.00017% of the people that are ruling over the 99.99983. That is not democracy, but aristocracy, rule of the elite.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Now this leads us to an even more fundamental question. What is, quote, government, unquote? The dictionary explanation is totally useless because what you understand about, quote, government and what you think it is, regardless of whether, quote, government, unquote, even exists, determines our society and has done so for thousands of years. So, I would love to know what you really think government is. And let's continue our discussion. This is your mind. It is the only place in which, quote, government, unquote, exists. This is the prison built for you and all of humanity by the aristocracy, the global elite, or the ruling class. They've been ruling over you and all of mankind for thousands of years with the false idea of, quote, government, close quote. Once they convince society that government exists, then controlling the populations of the world is a simple procedure. Sometimes it's necessary to change the face of, quote, government, unquote, from one form to another so that the perceived participation is increased or reduced, but still the control continues.
This isn't real.
How do you define government? Government is the popularly held but entirely false belief that one mortal man or woman or a small group of mortal men or women possess mystic, superhuman powers to rule over the whole of society or humanity by force, and these mystic powers are not endowed on the rest of humanity, that supposedly mysteriously they are derived from political rituals like so-called elections, but everyone's supposed to believe this power comes from the people, those who have never possessed this power.
You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today.
You probably find it hard to believe that you've been duped. But get rid of the mental inertia, because it will only impede your discovery of truth. You're probably thinking, but how could what my parents, my family, friends, and my ancestors have taught me be a big lie? That's easy to explain. First, notwithstanding, this is not the first time you are taught a lie, and also taught to further that lie. Remember the first time that you realized that the whole of society, your parents, your family, and friends lied to you about Satan Claus, and the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, and so forth. So don't be surprised that the global elite have been brainwashing everyone to lie about, quote, government, unquote, in order to get control over you, and that are 315.6 million people in the US, and the rest of the 7+ billion people. Watch out for mental inertia. Think back to your resistance before finally accepting that you had been deceived with that lie that was Satan's claws. Second, remember that just a few decades ago, everyone held the popular but false belief that the world was flat. The lie of, quote, government has perturbed humanity for thousands of years. And also, it was not that long ago that everyone believed that the earth was the center of the universe. It was a difficult challenge to wrestle those popularly held but totally false beliefs from humanity and replace them with the truth when there were few people with a vested interest. Nevertheless, recognize who stands to gain by maintaining the belief in this big lie. All the politicians throughout the world, all the contributors to politicians, all the enforcement agents, the local and state police, IRS agents, the FBI, CIA, and all the other usurpers, all those who receive a pittance for such as welfare recipients, military, quote, government workers, in exchange for real personal freedom and a real salary. But the most influential group are the owners of TV, radio, newspaper, and the true usurpers, the power-hungry global elite. Because if the big lie is unmasked, then they have the most to lose. They lose all their power. It would be impossible to establish totalitarian global control via the New World Order if nobody recognizes their power anymore. Now you can see why we need mutual solidarity, mutual union against these several 100,000 usurpers. There are 300 million people in the US alone who are tired of the unjust bullying of the ruling class, the theft, and the extortion. How do you defeat a bully? Joining together to confront them so they realize that society does not permit anymore their evil behavior. So if you feel uncomfortable, don't let that bother you. And don't blame your ancestors. People just thought it was better to be comfortable than understand the truth. When it comes to standing up to a bully, some people just are too afraid. Are you a truth seeker or a comfort seeker? This feeling of discomfort is because you feel helpless to move against the big lie, and it is to be expected. If you're willing to continue, I promise you, this is as uncomfortable as you will ever get. However, you are permitted to feel indignation at being lied to because the big lie has been used to pull the wool over your eyes, to blind you. And I'd recommend that you use that indignation to good use by forwarding this documentary to as many people as you know right now. Use Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, for example. It's a great way to help relieve this indignation in a great way. Now let's analyze this definition of so-called government.
Hey, an alien!
Yes, I've travelled across space to check on the progress of your species.
Cool. Shall I take you to our leader?
Your what?
Our leader, the guy in charge.
The guy in charge of what?
Well, in charge of everything.
You have one guy in charge of everything?
No, he's in charge of government.
What is government?
Well, government makes the rules for us. It tells us what we can do and what we can't do.
So is government really smart? They come up with wise rules for you to follow?
Well, mostly. But some of its rules are really stupid.
Do you disregard those rules?
No, we have to follow the rules, even if they are stupid or we disagree with them. Government punishes anyone who disobeys the rules.
So you are slaves to government?
No, it's not like that at all. Government works for us, the people. It serves us. We're the boss.
It tells you what to do, and it punishes you with violence if you disobey it, and yet you're its boss?
Yeah.
But there are some things government does that you don't like.
Well, yeah, not everything government does is popular. Like spending on wars, for example.
What is a war?
It's when government basically spends the people's money on weapons and soldiers and then sends them over to the other side of the world to kill a bunch of people over there and destroy their country. I don't like it that government does this.
Well, I can see why you might not like that. Have you humans reached the stage where you generally consider stealing, enslaving, and killing each other to be bad things?
Oh yeah, we know that. Don't steal, don't attack, don't assault.
But you give money to government and they use it to kill people.
Well, yeah. But government does good things with tax money as well.
Why don't you stop paying for the things you don't like and only pay for the good things it does?
No, we can't do that. You can't just decide to stop paying taxes because the rules say that everyone has to pay taxes.
But the rules come from government though, don't they?
Yeah.
So government made a rule which says that everyone has to pay them money. So everyone pays taxes because if they didn't, government would punish them using violence?
Well, yes, but most people don't mind paying taxes. Most people feel obligated to pay taxes and obey government laws because it's for the good of society. Society needs government, and that means we all have to pay taxes.
So just to make sure I've got this straight, government makes the rules and you feel obligated to follow the rules, even the ones you don't like, and it tells you what to do and threatens to punish you if you don't do what it says, and it uses some of the money that it's taken from you using threats of violence to pay for things you don't like and actually think are immoral, like mass murder.
Yeah, but we can ask it to please tell us to do smart things, and please don't take our money and use it to kill people. We're allowed to ask them to tell us to do what we want them to tell us to do.
Are you guys just scared of this thing? Is government some huge monster that can just squish you at any moment if you disobey?
No, government isn't a monster.
Well, what is it then? Could you draw me a picture of it?
Government isn't really the sort of thing you can draw a picture of.
Maybe you could take me to it. Where is government?
You mean the building?
Government is a building.
No, but the politicians who make up the government have buildings they work from.
So government is a group of these politicians?
Yeah.
Okay, so what species are these politicians?
Well, they're human.
Like you?
Yeah.
So politicians are humans and they're government. You're a human, but you're not government.
No.
So it's the politicians, they're the ones that boss the rest of you around and make you do things you don't want to do and take your money using threats of violence. But even though you're all humans, you're not allowed to boss them around and take their money?
No, they'd put us in a cage if we did that. But look, it's not like the politicians can just do whatever they want. Like, a politician can't just come up to me on the street and make me give him money. They can't do that. Politicians can only do things like that in their job, when they're working for government.
Oh, so politicians aren't government? they just work for government.
Yeah.
Okay, so government isn't a monster, and it isn't a building, and it's not politicians, it's something else. And it employs politicians, who are just regular humans who get to order everyone else around and take their money. How does a regular human become a politician?
Well, that's the great thing about our government. It's a democracy, and that means that the people actually have the power, because we get to decide who among us get to be the politicians. We get to vote. And if a politician starts doing things we don't like, we can just replace him with someone else at the next election.
So the people that get chosen to be politicians only get to boss people around and take their money for a short time, and then they go back to being regular humans?
Exactly.
That sounds like a powerful position to be in. But if you get to choose who does that, I assume that politicians are always the wisest, most honest, caring and respected people among you.
Well, no, not really. I wouldn't say politicians are known for being honest, or wise, or caring. And they're certainly not the most respected people among us. Come to think of it, most politicians are lying, power-hungry crooks.
The ones you chose?
Yeah, they're always doing things we don't like. They use taxpayers' money to enrich themselves and their friends, and they never keep their promises to voters. They've been caught stealing and lying and taking bribes, and they mostly do what the big corporations want. Yeah, they're always doing stuff like that. They're completely corrupt. They're a bunch of lying crooks.
But you said that most humans know that stealing and beating each other up and killing are wrong. And you said that you have the power because you can change who's in charge. So why don't you just replace the lying, thieving, murderous, crooked politicians with some regular people?
Well, we don't try to elect lying crooks. It just always turns out that way. But we have to have a government because some humans are nasty and might kill or enslave or steal. Civilization just couldn't survive without government.
Let me get this straight. Because you're worried about the small number of nasty people that are willing to kill, enslave and steal, you think it's necessary for your survival to have a system where some humans among you, for a short while, get to call themselves the government, and they get to order everyone else around like slaves, and, if they want, commit mass murder overseas, using money they stole using threats of violence. Politicians get to kill, enslave and steal because if they didn't, someone else might? And you try to elect good, honest people to be politicians, but what happens every time is that the people you elect turn out to be corrupt, evil, lying crooks. That's your system.
Yeah, that's pretty much government.
Now let's analyze this definition of so-called, quote, government, unquote, piece by piece to show you how accurate and true this definition really is. Quote, government is the popularly held but entirely false belief that one mortal man or woman or a small group of mortal men or women possess mystic superhuman powers that they euphemistically call, quote, authority, unquote, to rule over the whole of society or humanity by force and violence, and that these mystic powers are not endowed on the rest of humanity, even though politicians, quote unquote, are supposed to derive their, quote, authority, unquote, from the people. Therefore, we can only assume that supposedly mysteriously these, quote, powers, unquote, are derived from the political rituals like so-called elections, because everyone is supposed to believe this, quote, power comes from the people, those who have never possessed this power. This belief is very popular among the brainwashed masses. Almost everyone believes in, quote, government, unquote, including you until now. This is a falsely held belief. Let's suppose a maniac scientist were able to use mass hypnosis to make everyone forget that any, quote, government, unquote, ever existed. The IRS would send notifications, or the police would turn on their lights and sirens, and everyone would just ignore them. In other words, quote, government, unquote, relies on everyone's belief in it in order to take the power you give it. As soon as nobody believes in it, it fades into folkloric fables. This means it does not exist, never existed, and never will exist, so therefore belief in it is totally false. Possess mystic superhuman powers. The claim is that, quote, the government, unquote, derives its, quote, authority, unquote, from the people. But how could this be true if the people do not have the power to extort money, nor force the will on others, to kidnap, to kill, to rob, or to steal? If no one recognized the so-called, quote, authority, unquote, the 0.00017% of the people would no longer have total control anymore. Please notice that a dictatorship is a government in which absolute rule of power by force is exercised by a person or small group of people exercising absolute power, especially those who have absolute unrestricted control in a, quote, government, unquote, absolute, imperious, and overbearing power or control. That is the exact definition of all forms of, quote, government, unquote, government by force. These mystic powers are not endowed on the rest of humanity. The 99.99983% consider the U.S. Constitution claim that, quote, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, close quote. Where did this magic power come from? Just because it was written on a piece of parchment a few hundred years ago by people who are just about decomposed by now? It must be awfully magical parchment and very special ink, because it most certainly was not, quote, we the people of the United States, unquote, because extortion is not a right that is self-evident, since when could I hold up a bank in order to give to the poor? Or when was highway robbery legalized so I could give the money to people I deemed more deserving? Since this alleged, quote, authority, unquote, is not derived from the people, then supposedly mysteriously they are derived from political rituals like so-called elections. Pretty amazing, those elections, aren't they? Now this brings me to my next series of questions. Were you ever consulted to determine which type of, quote, government, unquote, you wanted, or if you even wanted any type of, quote, government, unquote, even though you may have never considered that there has ever been a dictatorship in the U.S. or the country where you reside? I feel it my responsibility to inform you, you were born in and under a dictatorship. You live in one now, and until it changes, your descendants will die under this dictatorship. First, to understand this, any type of, quote, government, unquote, be it democracy, federal republic, dictatorship, monarchy, or any other type of so-called, quote, government, unquote, is just a euphemism for a dictatorship of the aristocracy, the ruling class. If you feel that I'm lying to you, please stop paying, quote, taxes, or drive contrary to posted traffic laws, and see how long it takes the aristocracy to have you kidnapped or extorted, or both. Now, are you able to consider with me the political system in the country where you reside? It seems that all over the world the system is, quote, broken, unquote, and failing, and that there is no real way to approach the ruling class other than begging their permission. Notice the language in the U.S. Constitution as an example. Quote, Congress, remember the 545 people in Washington, D.C. as of the 113th Congress, shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What audacious language! How magnanimous of the ruling class, the slave owners. If you feel that the political system is not working for you, then you can ask permission of the slave owners to make changes. But until the ruling class make any changes, even if they decide to, you are still required to bear the abuse. Entertain for a moment the possibility the system is not broken nor failing, but doing exactly what its creators designed it to do and to be. A barrier, an impediment to keep the slaves away from the slave owners. Whereas recognize that in the corporate world, if you're working at a job that does not live up to your expectations, you fire your boss and you get another one, or go in business for yourself. In a free market of employment, you can change immediately and at any time. Why is there no free market option in the political system? And why are you not permitted access to change it? Only that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nowhere is it mentioned extortion as one of the inalienable rights. Now recognize the fallacy of the line of thinking that a little extortion is, quote, necessary for the common welfare, unquote. If we, the people, allow any extortion, then there is nothing to stop the ruling class from eventually extorting everything from the people and put us in a worse situation than under King George. In fact, the percentage that Georgie was charging was a minuscule fraction to that the Congress, quote unquote, is charging currently. Now the Declaration of Independence continues, quote, that to secure these rights, quote, governments, unquote, are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, close quote. A totally false concept. Quote, government, unquote, does not have the authority for threat of violence because, quote, the governed, unquote, do not possess this right or power. However, recognize the correct statement. Quote, governments, unquote, are instituted among men, apparently deriving their abusive powers from the mass indoctrination or mass hallucination of the governed. Where there is threat of violence, there is no liberty nor freedom. This is a dictatorship. However, the solution is provided in the Declaration of Independence, quote, that whenever any form of, quote, government, close quote, becomes destructive of these ends, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The solution, quote, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such, quote, government, close quote, and to provide new guards for their future security, close quote. Very simply, the 315.6 million people of the U.S. need to set the example to throw off the old, outdated, non-existent government because, quote, government does not possess the power to extort money. Quote, government, close quote, is just a false belief, a superstition. According to the Declaration of Independence, quote, government's authority comes from us. So it is time to revoke Congress's permit. This work is inspired on the intuitive work by Larkin Rose in his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, 2011. I highly recommend his more in-depth treatise on this important subject. Independent thought. There are basically two types of people who initially oppose changing the system. People who have considered the options but have faulty data, or society's brainwashing has left many people afraid of changing to a truly free system. Why? Because they are afraid of the possible theft of a criminal on the street, but have been taught to disregard the trillions extorted without fail annually from, quote, government, close quote. They're afraid of a possible murder or threat to their health, but seem oblivious to the 260 million people decimated in the last century and the beginning of this century because of, quote, government. Furthermore, they ignore the facts of poisonous substance that, quote, government deliberately orders put in our food and water to reduce the population and reduce fertility. I prefer the minute possibility of private danger to the guaranteed, quote, government, unquote, danger. And what is the cost of freedom? How many real crimes are committed because unstable people recognize that the, quote, government steals, commits fraud and murder, so why not he? Every day there are, quote, government, close quote, drones that threaten us, or eavesdropping occurs in all of your phone calls, email, text messages, etc. And the percentage of deaths that occur in routine, quote, traffic stops, unquote, by the so-called, quote, government, close quote, enforcement thugs,
not recognized as criminals, but criminals just the same,
is so much greater than the threat of a
recognized
criminal on the street. Please prove to me that the use of the, quote, government, close quote, is better than true self-government. The lie that is the excuse for claiming the, quote, need, close quote, of, quote, government, close quote, has come to its end. Now the other group have not even considered the possibility of changing the system. Let me tell you what voluntary egalitarian autocracy is not. Some people could confuse a superficial look at voluntary egalitarian autocracy and say that it is anarchy. Let me tell you why that is a false analysis. Anarchy means no rule, but every normal person is already self-governed to not murder, steal, or commit fraud, not hurt others, well, at least intentionally. It is innate to being a human being. Everyone knows that. There are the tiny exceptions of abnormal, criminal-minded people who still know but ignore morals. And please recognize that this is a small fraction of the current prison population. And of these true criminals, there is an even smaller fraction of the truly mentally ill. Now, the overwhelming majority of the people in jail are those who are caged to punish independent, thinking, free people. People who understood that taxes are extortion, or use drugs that do not harm any other person, and any other, quote, violations, close quote, claimed from the, quote, government, close quote, mandate. Now, the second type of people are those who are never even considered the concept of voluntary egalitarian autocracy and have the easiest time to understand the concept because they have had no previous fault data input. So now, can we reason together? Do you really believe a tiny, minuscule 1/10,000th of the population of the U.S., based in Washington, D.C., who almost 100% have always had access to wealth their entire life? I did not say we're wealthy. They had access to wealth. Do you think they could know best of how to run your personal finances, your company, your family, build your house or remodel it, drive your car, know what is best for you to eat and drink with your personal allergies or likes or dislikes, genetic makeup, or know what is best for you to do in your life? Do you think they even have any clue? So how could any serious justification of, quote, government, close quote, be made? I have an original idea that, as far as I can determine, has never been considered. Why has the U.S. never been invaded? Do you think for a minute that China even considers the possibility of a physical invasion? Of course not. Consider for a moment the vastness of the U.S. It would be impossible to control the population in order for an invading army not to lose. Two reasons. One, because of the great territory, and two, the dispersion of the 315.6 million population. This fictitious invading army could probably take over large cities, but then how would they control every tiny city all over the U.S.? If China sent the entire population over, there would not be enough to take control physically. As far as mentally, the population was not subjugated. So, Consider, therefore, that as soon as the idea of, quote, government, close quote, is removed from the thought process, the threat of the criminals also does not hold water as a true justification of the supposed, quote, need, close quote, of, quote, government. Now, what is the solution? It is the easiest thing in the world. It is a series of non-adherence and non-compliance. In other words, don't do anything. Stop paying extortion. Without money, those extortionists in Washington, D.C., well, the D.C. crats will still keep creating money out of thin air. But in the State House where you reside and the so-called City Hall will be stopped dead in their tracks. Stop paying any more money. They won't be able to squabble over your money anymore. Stop paying 1 more cent to the IRS, to the state, or to City Hall. There is no such thing as a tax, but just extortion. And don't worry that, quote, government won't have money. When they have to negotiate for continuation of projects that we, the people, approve of, the money will be there. But concerning the, quote, Congress, close quote, when they cannot extort money, then Congress will fulfill one of their only few legitimate responsibilities and print the nation's money, totally free of the central bank. The proceeds from extortion is measured in tens of millions. But the Federal Reserve has created out of thin air over 33 trillion in the last few years alone. The Federal Reserve scheme's time has run out. And since their charter expires the end of this year, 2013, it is time to say good riddance. It's time to use your money for what you want it to be spent on, for the good of humanity, and not for wars in foreign countries. It has come time to shake off the shackles of slavery that we allowed to be put on ourselves. Since we let them be put on, we can just as easily shake them off. Now is the time for real freedom. Freedom from theft. Freedom from extortion. Freedom from intimidation. Tell those bullies throughout the United States or the country in which you reside that there are too few of them compared to us. Many people wonder, what kind of resistance will we meet? It depends on our united stance. There are over 315.6 million people in the U.S. If only a not-so-ambitious 5% of the nation stands up to them, that will be over 12.75 million people compared to the 545 members of Congress and about 100,000 of the IRS agents. Almost 13 million versus 100,545. How did we get a little flea telling us what to do? Brush off that flea and prohibit it from sucking any more of our blood. Aftermath. Will there be need of leadership? Real leadership? Of course. With all the so-called, quote, government, close quote, come grinding to a halt? Of course. But then truly voluntary systems of real contributions will be implemented. The actual structure of the present, quote, government, close quote, is not the problem, but the threat of violence for non-compliance. This threat of violence is what invalidates the, quote, government, close quote. If those in, quote, government, close quote, want to negotiate similar situations without threat of violence to make contributions for the public teachers, essential services such as water, sewer, garbage collection, etc., then we can make a deal. Furthermore, with the full payment directly to these services, the employees will see an almost double in their compensation. The cost for these services will be drastically reduced. Some former so-called, quote, government, close quote, employees will have to learn a real trade, but that is their just recompense for selling out their former brother and sister slaves. Nevertheless, much of the former structure will be able to continue, just with the elimination of threats of violence, as the former slaves become the real masters and gain real personal freedom. And how do we handle the borders of the U.S.?
Simple. We will negotiate real representatives to handle foreign affairs. Without the trillions of dollars at their disposal, all the foreign torture, killing, and mass murder of other human beings, of our brothers and sisters in the far reaches of the world, will abruptly end, and all the soldiers will come home to help make the welcome transition. Democide has killed more people than anything else. I recommend Alex Jones' report on democide on his YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/the Alex Jones channel, or on prisonplanet.com. Every day that passes without your action, or shall we say inaction, is one step closer to less freedom and more death and destruction to our brothers and sisters, others of humanity, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, with the same aspirations that you and I have. It is time for the 315.6 million people of the U.S. to tell Congress, you are no longer our masters. Your license is hereby revoked. We the people are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As far as, quote, government is concerned, it is diametrically opposed to these guaranteed rights. Congress, your permit is hereby revoked. Will it be scary? Of course. The Founding Fathers were going against the greatest empire of the century. We are doing the same. However, we have something they didn't have, the internet, and a clear understanding that we don't need violence, nor threat of violence to accomplish those means. We don't even need a revolution. We don't need to march on Washington, D.C. The problem is not in Washington, but in our minds. The Founding Fathers did an excellent experiment of Liberty 1.0, but it wasn't successful. Nevertheless, it has given us the insight we need to take humanity to the real thing, Liberty and Freedom 2.0. Maintain your focus. When you destroy your license plates, remain strong and steadfast. And beware the naysayers. They will call you all kinds of things. Could you imagine what George Washington's mother told George? You can imagine the earful she gave him.
Probably only 5 or 10% of the population will participate initially, but others will join when they start to see results. Can you taste the savor of freedom like I can?
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
This is the story of your enslavement, how it came to be, and how you can finally be free. Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them. At first, we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical and terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death and of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable and so valuable in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human beings. You can frighten an animal, because animals are afraid of pain in the moment. But you cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty, with torture or imprisonment in the future, because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat. You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him. This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax. Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is: a series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields, and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into? There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion. Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip and the brand and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control. The second phase was the Roman model, wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity, and creativity, which raised their productivity. This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government, and with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power, and collapsed. I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar. After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation. Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords. This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated and hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people. The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities, which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership. As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations. Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model. The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners. You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay to your masters.
Value this time in your life, kids, because this is the time in your life when you still have your choices. And it goes by so fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. 30s, you raise your family, you make a little money, you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin. Music starts to get too loud. One of your old girlfriends from high school becomes a grandmother. 50s, you have a minor surgery. You'll call it a procedure, but it's a surgery. 60s, you'll have a major surgery. The music is still loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear it anyway. 70s, you and the wife retire to Fort Lauderdale. So you eat dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10, breakfast the night before. Spend most of your time wandering around malls looking for the ultimate soft yogurt and muttering, how come the kids don't fall? How come the kids don't fall? In the 80s, you'll have a major stroke. You end up battling with some Jamaican nurse who your wife can't stand, but who you call mama. Any questions?
Your few freedoms are preserved because they are profitable to your owners. The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers. The ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labor, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all. Ah well, nobody ever said that human farming was easy. Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a three-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education. As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock. It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea. Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
Officers positioned Grant face first on the floor with one officer near his head, a second near his back, and a third officer standing nearby. There appeared to be a brief struggle. Then, a 2-year veteran BART officer stands, draws his weapon, and fires.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If you can get the cows to attack each other whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly. Those cows who become dependent upon the stolen largesse of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership. And the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, you will harm your fellow cows. The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of the violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent continual external threats so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end. The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms. The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed the size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms. In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest. This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership, without the violence of taxation and statism. To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.